Hi, good morning. And thank you, Howard, for having me here. It's really a pleasure and a delight. I'm a geriatric psychiatrist, and I always wondered about aging. That if you really think about that, human aging does not make sense from the Darwinian perspective. The Darwinian perspective is that there is survival for the fittest. And you see that in the animal kingdom, most of the large animals do not live long after they lose fertility. And they also become physically disabled unless they are in protected environment like zoo or a research lab. The human lifespan has increased significantly. It used to be 47 years in the US in 1900. Today it is 80, and very soon it will be 90. So it has almost doubled. However, the fertility span has not changed. The age of menopause and andropause, the male equivalent, has remained same over the century, around 45 to 50. Health span also has not changed. We still develop arthritis, diabetes, hypertension in our middle age. So when somebody lives to age 90, that means they are spending the whole half of their lifetime without fertility and getting physically disabled. There is really no survival benefit for the species unless something improved with aging. And is that wisdom? So I started thinking about that, whether that might be possible explanation. The first question is, of course, then what is wisdom? How do you define wisdom? So we started with a review of the empirical literature. As everybody here knows, the empirical literature probably started in the 1970s with Baltis and a number of other people in this room have contributed to that literature. So we looked at studies that had specific operational definitions of wisdom. We found about 20 some studies, and we looked at the different components. I think everybody agrees, that those who believe it's a trait, that it has different components. So we wanted to find out what is the common component. Next, with Monica and others, we put together a panel of experts who actually also had time and who agreed to participate. And the questions were, is wisdom same as or different from intelligence and spirituality? The general agreement, yes, it is different. And what are the components? And there is a large agreement with the empirical literature. The problem with both of these is that this is modern Western conceptualization. So what did people think about wisdom centuries ago in an entirely different part of the world? So we looked at Gita. So this is kind of an Indian Bible, if you will. And we did a mixed methods, qualitative, quantitative study with a medical anthropologist as a consultant to look at the components of wisdom in the Gita. And what was interesting was that the components of wisdom were surprisingly similar across these areas. So they include emotional regulation, pro-social behaviors like compassion, empathy, altruism, social decision making, self-understanding, reflection, insight, acknowledgement of uncertainty, and decisiveness. These are the common ones. There are some where there is some disagreement: spirituality, openness to new experience, sense of humor, and so on. But the similarity was really interesting. Why has the basic concept of wisdom not changed over centuries and across different regions? To me, it suggested that wisdom may be biologically based. That's why it hasn't changed. The concept hasn't changed. If it is biologically based, where would it be based? Obviously in the brain, but where in the brain? How do you even think about localizing wisdom in the brain, right? So we started with so I actually did a Google search of wisdom and neurobiology. There were very few articles, except for those written by people whose last name was Wisdom. So that's about it. So what we did then was to look at neurobiology of individual components of wisdom, like compassion, empathy, emotional regulation, and their antithesis. For example, antithesis of emotional regulation is impulsivity. Pro-social behavior is antisocial personality. And there is quite a bit of literature actually on neurobiology of individual traits and their antithesis. And then we also looked at what I call experiments of nature, where people who are wise, something happens and they become unwise. I'll give some examples of that. I'll just give one example of that as a result of brain trauma, but there is also a disease called frontotemporal dementia. This is a dementia that usually occurs in the 50s, doesn't affect memory, primarily affects the personality. And if you look at the description, it is exact antithesis of wisdom. So, one case I think some of you may know, Phineas Gage. He was a construction worker in Vermont in the mid 19th century. This is his picture after. So, he is carrying a large iron rod. That's I will show you. It went through his head, and his left eye is blind because it went through his left eye. So, this is what happened. This was an article published in Science that showed where the damage was. This is his description. So, before that he was a smart, nice, wise man according to everybody. After this trauma, he became fitful, irreverent, profane, non-differential, impatient, obstinate, capricious, vacillating, devising and then quickly abandoning plans, childish, passionate. His mind was so radically changed that his friends said he was no longer Gage. Interestingly, nothing else changed. He had no other neurological damage. His IQ, his memory did not change, and the only thing was his blindness in the left eye. So, where was the damage? And that's the article in Science. So, they found that it was primarily localized to his left prefrontal cortex. There have been dozens such cases, modern day Phineas Gages, in which there is evidence from neuropsychological testing and brain imaging where the damage is. So, combining all that, the neurobiology of these individual traits, their antithesis, and then this experience of nature as I call them, we concluded that there are two primary brain regions that are involved in wisdom. One is prefrontal cortex, and the prefrontal cortex includes the dorsolateral part, ventromedial part, and the anterior cingulate, something that connects them. And then there is amygdala. What is interesting is that the prefrontal cortex is the newest part of the brain in evolution. It is what makes us human, the executive functioning, control over emotions, etc. Amygdala, on the other hand, is the oldest part of the brain in evolution, emotions. So, in a way, the neurobiology of wisdom, the postulated neurocircuitry of wisdom suggested, it suggests that it involves balance between emotions and cognition, between the prefrontal, the newest and the oldest part of the brain. The one question is, does wisdom increase with aging? And again, many people in this room have contributed, but there are studies show that older people are better than younger ones in most of the aspects that I listed under wisdom. We just did a study in which we looked at about 1500 people in the community from age 21 to 100. We found that the physical health declines with age, not a surprise, but look at the well-being, it goes in the opposite direction. And in a study that Monica and I have been doing, it looks like the well-being is associated with wisdom. So, if we assume that wisdom increases with aging to some extent in some people, how can we explain it neurobiologically? Because when I went to medical school, I was taught that the only thing that happens to brain with aging is brain shrinks. It loses neurons, synapses, blood vessels, we lose memory and everything, right? How can anything get better? Well, in the last 15-20 years, there is a lot of literature suggesting neuroplasticity of aging that suggests that people who are active physically, cognitively and socially, more neuronal networks are involved in performing a mental activity to compensate for the loss of synapses and neurons. And not just that, but even new synapses and new neurons are formed in those who are active. And by the way, this has been shown in multiple animal species, from rats and mice to cats, dogs and monkeys. So, it is really well established neuroscience of aging. But what about emotions? Why there is positivity? The brain imaging studies show that the amygdala becomes less responsive to stressful stimuli in older age. So, it looks like there is some biological basis for the various pro-social and other components of wisdom, but also for emotional regulation. This is my last but one slide. So, this is all good for the individuals, but what about the species? How does it contribute to the species survival? So, there is something called grandma hypothesis of wisdom. Studies have shown that when grandparents are involved in raising their grandchildren, so children live longer, they are happier, and they produce more children than the grandparents did. This has been shown in bottlenose dolphins, killer whales, some species of birds and in humans. The study in humans was based on multi-generational families in Canada and Denmark. It's published in Nature. So there is really strong evidence about, so when we become old, we can't reproduce ourselves, but we are helping the younger generations live longer, be more fertile. And just last year, a paper was published by some of my colleagues at UCSD in PNS. We showed that certain variants of genes, specifically CD33, which is for better immune function, and ApoE for less amyloid in heart and brain, they are more common in humans than in chimpanzees. So the idea is that there are grandparent genes which help some people who are more active to not only age longer but function better in old age. So they can contribute to their grandchildren's wisdom as well as longevity and fertility. So this is my last slide. So I conceptualize wisdom as a complex multi-component trait that involves dynamic but balanced integration of various components, the whole being greater than the sum of its part. But wisdom is purposeful, and the purpose is to enhance the well-being of the self and enhance the well-being of the species. So, and there may be biological and even evolutionary basis for age-associated increase in wisdom. Obviously, one of the components of wisdom is knowing that what you know you don't really know. And so, is this really true? I mean, this is an hypothesis, but I think there is strong enough evidence to pursue that further, but clearly more research is needed. So, thank you for your attention.
Very interesting talk, Dilip. I have a question. So you basically associate this, the brain-based with aging and I don't know, coming with experience or biological basis, right? Are you aware of any research in terms of, and this is really not my area of expertise, but there's more and more research in terms of mindfulness and meditation and their effect on the brain. Is this connected in any way?
Sure. I think when I say biology, biology is totally affected by psychology and sociology. I mean, there's no question about that. I mean, this is an artificial distinction, you know, nature versus nature, all of that. The epigenetics clearly shows that the environment affects the gene expression. So, and there are studies, I mean, you talked about mindfulness and meditation. Number of studies have shown the biological effects of those. Some studies have shown that these are associated with better white matter integrity in the brain. And even more interestingly, studies show that meditation for 6 months, there was one study showed that it increased the activity of an enzyme called telomeres, which is, so that telomere is the end of the chromosome. It's like shoelace, you know, the end, and every time the cell divides, the telomere becomes shorter. And one day it disappears and then the cell dies. So by looking at our telomeres, that's the idea, that we may know actually how much life is left. You know, like everything in science, this is not proven. But so, but this study was really interesting and important. And again, there are several others that replicated that finding that things like meditation and mindfulness, which are purely psychological, can have impact on physical functioning and biological markers. And this does not apply only to this. There are studies, there are meta-analysis of something like 80 studies of optimism and 140 studies of social engagement. They found that people who were more optimistic and who had greater social support, who were more socially engaged, had significantly longer lifespans, less risk of developing heart disease, hypertension, and also they recovered faster. So this is not really any more TV science or feel-good science. It's just real biologically based intervention.
Great, thanks.
Have any studies been done on senior citizens who maintained exercise and serious intellectual activity? I can think of one chap who was a professor at the law school here at the University of Chicago. He literally worked to the day before he died, and he was famous for it.
Yeah, actually, that's the type of work we are very interested in. We have been doing at UC San Diego. So I'm the director of the Stein Institute for Research on Aging, and our focus is on successful aging. So looking at what makes some older people do much better than others. I mean, we usually know about some rare people, somebody who ran a marathon at the age of 90 and so on. But much more common are people who may have physical disabilities or illnesses, but who are functioning at a high level. You know, so we have artists who continue to function well in their later lives. There are coaches, politicians, writers. And what often distinguishes them from others is high level of physical activity to the extent they can, cognitive activity and social activity. I think those are critical for that neuroplasticity that I described. So there are actually these studies clearly showing that there are ways of successful aging, which of course include diet and things like that, but clearly activities are important. Yeah.
I'll just do it very quickly. I really like this talk, Dilip. I'm just trying to think, when you say balanced integration of various components as part of this trait, and when I think of neurobiology and then try to sort of map it on human behavior, I'm always wary of the reverse inference problem. That is, for those of you who don't know, you can just, if you just say, look, this gene or this particular part of the brain is doing X, that's an inference, and quite often it's wrong because it happens in a particular context, in a particular situation in which you're studying it. So it's completely determined by the context in which you examine that. So I'm wondering, you say that, well, of course, epigenetics is important, but I wonder if I could push it further for you and say that, well, when you measure it, you always measure it in a particular context, in particular when you're mapping it on the behavior, on the expression of this through your action, or such as generativity or generosity or whatever, or through your reasoning, how to handle an ethical dilemma, you will always be situating it in a particular environment. Am I on the right track? Would you agree with that?
You're absolutely on the right track, and there is no question that the context matters. But you know, there are some studies, for example, there are some brain imaging studies you can do now, where they are mapping the blood flow in the brain as well as oxygen utilization while you are doing something.
Right.
And there are studies of something called moral dilemmas, where you present a dilemma to a person. You say, I think many of you may be familiar with that, but this crying baby dilemma, for example, I mean, there's a war going on, the soldiers outside, and a group of 30 people hold inside, and baby starts crying, and what do you do? And whether you choke the baby so that other people will be saved, and obviously it's a very difficult. So and these are studies again published in journals like Science and Nature that show that depending on what people decide to do, the brain activity changes. So there are some people who would quickly come to a conclusion that this is right or this is right. Their activity in those regions that I described, the prefrontal cortex, dorsolateral, ventromedial, anterior cingulate, differs from the people who take a long time and who's, they're thinking whether this is good, this is good, I don't know. So you can actually, you can see that in the brain. Again, that neuroscience is still at an early stage, but I think we are beginning to look at that. And the context there becomes important, clearly.
I'm just thinking that this balanced integration of various components could also be dependent on the context, how exactly that integration happens.
True, absolutely. And that's where probably the cultural issues would come into play also. Yeah.
Okay. First of all, it was very, very interesting talk. One of the questions that I had was that going back to your original the traits that you had taken from the Indian book that you had mentioned previously, the initial basis of which you kind of developed the idea of wisdom. One of the traits that I thought was really interesting that was in your bracketed portion was openness to new experiences, being able to react to new experiences. And I actually could conceptualize this, particularly when you were looking at wisdom as a trait characteristic. I would think that this would be a very important one, is being able to not just be able to maintain a balance if everything stays the same, but being able to maintain this balance in an ever-changing environment, particularly when you're dealing with people who are living for a very long time. The reason I bring this up is that I think commonly older people are conceptualized as being less open to change and less being able to adapt to things, and thereby potentially making less wise decisions. I think with the recent Brexit situation as an example, a lot of people conceptualized, said that the old people voted to leave Britain because they weren't open to change and it led them to make an unwise decision. Do you think that this openness to change and experience, particularly given the aging, is important? And do you think that older people are actually worse at this?
That's a great question. And I agree with you. I think the openness to new experience is something that is needed. And that's why actually one thing we stress for successful aging is intergenerational activities. Older people working with younger ones. And that helps in several ways. One is that younger people are, of course, there's a lot of enthusiasm, excitement, and so that rubs off on older people who may be lonely by themselves. On the other hand, this younger person there's a lot of peer pressure, competition. For them, it is good to see some older person who is calm, quiet, tells them what to do, right? So it rubs up, but also this openness to new experience. I 100% agree. That's so critical for successful aging. So I think it is hard to generalize. In the sense, not all people become rigid with aging, and so it is only some people who become wiser with age. I mean, obviously, everybody doesn't. I wish everybody. I could also become wiser, hopefully. But so people who are open to new experience and who are active physically, cognitively, socially, they are the ones who are, I think, going to be wiser, and they are going to have more neuroplasticity. Yeah.
Yeah, I too really enjoyed your talk. Thank you. Your grandparent effect. There is a genetic contribution to longevity. Is there evidence that suggests that, in fact, the grandparent effect is related to nurturance, or is it just a matter of longevity?
Very good question. I think nurturing clearly plays an important role because these are the studies in whales and dolphins and birds that show that it doesn't have to be grandparents themselves biologically, but they're called grandparent helpers. So not exactly biologically, but somebody in the family or in that species, somebody others older who are there, they are taking care of the younger ones. Those younger ones will do better. So I don't think it is primarily biological or genetic. It is primarily, I think, more the nurturing and also transfer of wisdom across the generation. I personally also think it is not just transferring wisdom to the grandchildren, but to your own children. I mean, from another perspective, think about this, that humans have the longest period of the period needed to become mature, right? I mean, we have the whole young childhood and adolescence, and the brain continues to evolve during adolescence. There is synaptic pruning and so on. So actually, the brain is not fully developed until almost the age of 18, 19, 20, right? So, and at that age, the person can become a parent, right? So the grandparents are needed also to teach the parents about how to take care of their children. So when we talk about grandparent effects, I think we often underestimate the effects of older people on their own children who are helping their children grow, right? So it is much broader issue, I think, and and it is both biological and nurturing, so psychosocial.
So I wanted to build on what Gary said. That was exactly what was on my mind, the idea of nurturing, but also the idea of service orientation and empathy and compassion. So when the gentleman at the back made the comment about intellectual and physical activity, I ran in my head the elderly people I know who are physically active and intellectually engaged, and they did not match up as well to my hunches about wisdom as people who were also engaged in some kind of service activity. And I realized that it's possible that the gentleman that you were referring to was also in some way dedicated to his students and had a great care for the people that he was serving in the capacity and talents that he was endowed with. And so I'd be so curious to know more about research related to service, because that is something that commute times and all the other stresses in our lives have chipped away at.
But
Thank
that's
you.
a-
for your
That's an
talk.
excellent, there is actually research, brain imaging research, that shows that when you do something for others, whether it is in the form of donation, gift, or just kindness, there are specific parts of the brain that light up. There's something called reward circuitry. And the reward circuitry, why do people smoke or drink, or they're addicted to something? Because it stimulates the reward circuitry. The reward circuitry can also be stimulated by doing something positive. So, and that's one of the reasons why people should donate and give money to. So, yeah, right. But there's no question about that. That doing these positive things actually, and that's what may relate to well-being also. That feeling you are doing something, contributing, and so there's a biological basis also. The increase in dopamine that occurs, which stimulates the reward circuitry. So, pro-social behavior is not good from the society, because it is more moral. It is actually good for our own neuroplasticity.